Are used audio cables worth it? Oh boy, here we go. I could not resist doing a reaction to this video that popped up in my suggested videos on my personal feed. It's with Paul McGowan of PS Audio and Octave Records, and I have always appreciated Paul's perspective on these shorter form videos that he does, where he tackles often kind of complex questions of complex subjects in only a few minutes time. But I find myself always kind of sharing my opinions with my own TV screen when I watch these. And, if I'm going to do that, I may as well stick a camera in front of my face, and maybe my thoughts and my experience can benefit you all too in your gathering of information and in your decision making. There's a fair amount to say about this topic. And I would say that this is a pretty brave subject in the sense that there exists a faction of people in the audio community, and especially in the high-end audio community, who refuse to buy into the possibility that cabling can make a difference, even though they might be perfectly open to the possibility of small manufacturing differences in vacuum tubes can make a difference to how they sound, and that op amps can sound different, and that the windings in transformers can make a difference, and every other aspect of component construction in audio can make a difference. For some reason, there exists this faction of people who are, it seems like, almost personally offended that anything better than lamp cord or the 30-year-old blister pack of $5 RCA interconnects from Radio Shack could even exist and make a difference. If you are somebody who is not open-minded to the possibility that different cables can sound different, then maybe this one isn't for you. But for those of us who have some actual experience with different cables and have tried different ones out and have heard some differences in them, this could be an interesting subject on whether it's worth it, and whether particularly those on the used market have any considerations or pitfalls. So with all of that being said, let's see what Paul has to say about this one, and I will certainly share my thoughts and experience along the way, too.
Bogdan in Romania writes, on the second-hand market, there are many, many cables with an age of 10, 15, or even 20 years. Cables that were once very expensive, top of the line, and which can now be purchased at affordable prices.
Yeah.
My question is, do the cables lose their properties over time, or do they remain at the same quality as if they were new?
Well, sorry to cut you off there, Paul, but I will say straight off the bat, there's not a lot that's really going to age or expire when it comes to audio cables. Whether they're 2 years old or 20 years old, they're pretty stable. However, there are elements to their construction that I think need some attention paid to them. Off the top of my head, how they're stored can affect internal materials, in certain constructions. For example, if the cables are made of organic materials, maybe there's an insulator made of cotton, for example, which is a legitimate insulator. If those cables were stored in really humid environments, that can certainly affect organic materials. Also, if there is jacketing or internal materials that are made of certain types of plastics, things like exposure to heat can definitely affect that. But I think really when it comes to audio cables changing over time, it's going to have a lot to do with how they were stored. But if they were stored correctly, there's really not too much to worry about when it comes to used audio cables. I think the only things I've seen, given that they're stored acceptably and that they're not exposed to really harsh environments, that would really change about them is that some kinds of connectors can oxidize over time. But this oxidation can certainly be cleaned off. So those are the first things that come to my mind when we're talking about what to watch out for with used audio cables. But let's see what Paul reckons.
Thanks much, and thank you for all the interesting and useful information you have to share with us over time.
Agreed.
Well,
Thanks, Paul.
my pleasure, sir. I would say the used cable market is one of the greatest values out there.
Oh, gonna stop you right there, Paul. Now that's a brave statement. One of the greatest values out there. I think I understand what he's saying as far as the topic of depreciation. Cables definitely can depreciate, and especially because they tend to be, other than a couple of really big companies, cables tend to be very much boutique items, and these companies can come and go over the years. Once you get a cable that's, 20 years old and maybe that company has already been gone for 10 years, there's a lot of depreciation there. And if they weren't making a large volume of these cables to begin with, then there aren't a lot of these cables on the used market, which means there's not much market rate set for their value. So yeah, cables that cost a lot of money many years ago could be obtained very cheaply, and that could present a value. Now, with that being said, the value of a cable really is a subjective thing, because you have to think in terms of what it can do for your system and how much it can be obtained for, and what percentage of the total value of your system it is, and what percent of improvement you think it can make in your system. So I hate to jump on Paul on that one. In terms of depreciation, yeah, there can be some tremendous value there, but in terms of what they can do for your system, there can definitely be some counter arguments to be made there. So what all have you got to say about that one, Paul? Let's find out.
Without much in the way of exception, I don't think cables lose anything over time. Now, those exceptions, some cables, depending on what kind of environments that they're in,
yep, there it is.
You can lose some insulation characteristics, especially in very humid environments. Asia, for instance, very humid. If it hasn't been in an air-conditioned space, you might find some problems, but I would say 99.9% of the time, it's not worth worrying about.
Well, 99% is optimistic. I would say this. First of all, very interested to see that he's thinking along the same terms as me as far as environment definitely being the primary factor in anything that you might have to worry about when it comes to used cables and internal deterioration. Yeah, really it has to do with how they're stored. If you're buying a cable that has consistently been in a system, then yeah, 99% of the time you don't need to worry. But that's a big if. If you're looking at a cable that's 20 years old, 30 years old, if it hasn't consistently been in a system, then you really want to know how it was stored. Was it baking in a 140-degree attic? Was it sitting in a basement that took on moisture and has been a high humidity environment. Those are things that you definitely want to know about. I would say the older a cable is, the more you would want to worry about that. And if you're communicating with a seller directly on those cables, you might just want to ask, how were they stored? If the ad doesn't say that it's always been in a temperature and humidity controlled environment, you kind of want to know whether it's just been sitting in some really challenging environment for some years before somebody finally went, you know what, I should really throw these on the market and get these out of my closet or out of my attic or out of my basement. So, when it comes to cables that have been sitting in storage, a lot more than 99% of the time, you could have some worries. Or if it's been sitting in a storage facility somewhere that's not a controlled environment, I would say you've got, more than that last 1% you need to worry about, right? If it's been in an attic or a basement, maybe half the time you really need to be concerned about that and ascertain whether that was a controlled environment or not. So if it was in a basement, okay, not a problem if it's a dry basement and there's a dehumidifier down there and there's nothing to worry about in that case, I don't think. If it's been in an attic, hopefully it's an insulated, temperature-controlled attic. Otherwise, if it's just been stuck up in the rafters and it's been baking under the heat of the sun in some hot attic, then you really do need to worry. That is probably something I would not want to buy, no matter how good a deal it is. Otherwise, if it's just been sitting in somebody's listening room closet, probably not much to worry about other than you might have some oxidized connectors that need a little bit of cleaning. And if the oxidation has been present on the connectors for a really long time, to the point that it could start to eat away at the metal of those connectors, that's something to worry about. You would want to know if the connectors have any noticeable pitting, or, if you were to clean some carbon off of those connectors, would you not have a smooth mating surface there to make a solid and complete connection to whatever component you're connecting them to? That is something to think about. But in that case, I think you would see it. You would see it in photographs of the cable, specifically of the cable terminations. I think it would be obvious that there would be that type of damage. The other thing to think about in terms of what can go wrong with used cables, and again, I think this would be really visible in photographs, is just to make sure that they haven't been mistreated. For example, if they were installed in a way that severely bent the cables to the point that conductors or dielectric material inside could have been physically broken. If there's if it's a really heavy gauge cable, like a braided cable, and some of the braids could have been damaged as a result of like a really tight 90-degree bend around something. If it was hooked up to a component and then shoved against a wall somewhere, that's something that you want to be careful about, that the conductor itself wasn't damaged or that dielectric material wasn't compromised at some point in the length of the cable. Also, you want to look and make sure it hasn't been, chewed up by somebody's pet or something like that. But again, you can spot that in photographs. So I would say if you're looking at a listing for audio cables and they do not have good quality photographs, and especially if they're old cables without photos, I'd be pretty careful with that. But I think that's a really common sense thing. Just don't get excited if you're looking at a listing that says these were $5,000 cables back in their day and I'm only asking $100 for them. But I'll add photos to this ad later. And of course, later never comes. I would not let your emotions get the better of you on that. You want to take some care and be careful about not getting overly excited about what you would perceive as a good deal, because Yeah, you don't want to end up with a set of cables that were a good deal because they're really roached out now. They've been improperly stored and they've been mistreated, or they've just had something about them compromised. So, use common sense and use your brain with these things. And as long as you do that and they've been properly stored, if not consistently deployed in a system, then yeah, you're probably okay. But gee, we're not halfway through this video. So what else has Paul got to say about this one? Let's find out.
So I just drug out my mentor, good friend, and former partner, Arnie Dudell, the late Arnie Dudell, who passed
I don't know him.
a number of years ago. I just pulled out a box of his personal cables that he fell in love with from Walter's, NBS cables, great cables.
I don't know those cables, NBS. Drop me a comment below if you have heard of those. I'd be curious to know what you know about them. Have you heard them? Were you ever familiar with them? What was their claim to fame? I just don't know anything about them. That's interesting, though.
They have been sitting in a box for probably 10, 15 years.
Sure.
And I pulled them out and I thought, I wonder how these sound. And I hooked them up and I thought, wow, I now remember why Arnie liked these so much. I mean, there are characteristics to those NBS cables that I didn't like so much, but
fair enough.
There were aspects to them that were just glorious, and they're still there. Those cables are probably worth a few $100s at the most, and they cost thousands of dollars new.
Yeah. I myself have been in that camp where I have owned cables that somebody paid new price for them, several $1,000s, and I got them for more in the hundreds. This was years ago. And there was no issue related to age with those cables. I'm nervous to say what the brand was because they're kind of a controversial brand. And in my case, I did not end up keeping them all that long because the thing that made those cables unique, which was a fluid-based dielectric material, also made them not work so well for my particular scenario. They were in a kind of a more high vibration environment, and this upset that fluid dielectric, and I kept swearing that I was just hearing fluctuations in how they sounded. So even though they were very beautifully constructed cables and they had fantastic locking connectors, and they were just they were very high quality cables, when they sounded good, they sounded really good, but they didn't always sound consistently. And after doing blind testing, I concluded that I wasn't just imagining things, the sound of these things would change. So I moved them on, and I moved them on for about what I paid for them, and somebody else got the same value as I did, and maybe they had a different experience with them, which is part of the fun of buying used cables. And I think why it's worth doing to buy cables used is you don't need to take that depreciation hit. You can try them out, especially if you're somebody who's not sold on the concept of audio cables making a difference. If you're dipping your toes into these waters, yeah, get some used ones. Make sure that you're paying a fair market price that you can recoup if you don't like them and want to sell them. And yeah, try them in your system, have some fun. If they don't work out, move them on, and you had virtually no loss at all financially, and maybe you had some fun trying that out. Such was the case with those weird fluid dielectric cables that I had tried out. But also, I'm loving this concept of Paul kind of fishing through somebody's box of forgotten equipment and finding some gems in there. Isn't that so fun when you get to make those kinds of finds? I do it to myself sometimes because over the years I've changed system configurations and I've changed rooms and I needed cables of a different length or I needed different connector types and maybe the cables were too nice to re-terminate myself. I didn't want to do that. So I will, instead of selling cables, sometimes just put them in the closet. And there they will sit until I reconfigure a system and suddenly they can work again. In my B system right now, which is my living room system, I'm using some old AudioQuest cables. They are AudioQuest slate cables that I had bought for a system probably 20 years ago, and they were already used when I bought them. In fact, these things are probably from the 1990s. And yeah, I'd bought them for a system 20 years ago, used them for several years. Then I reconfigured systems and these no longer worked for me. So in the closet they went, stored carefully in a controlled environment. And there they sat for years and years and years until a couple of years ago when I reconfigured my B system and I needed some different cables and I pulled these out. And yeah, they're maybe a little bit long for my needs in that system, but that's better than being too short. And I will say that they came out of storage exactly as they went in, and they sounded just the same as they ever did. And if anything, they probably outclass the integrated amplifier that I'm using in that system, which really just means that I never have to worry about the speaker cables in that system. They are more than good enough for that system, and I was glad that I still had them. And it was like kind of rediscovering an old friend because they're neither the fanciest nor the worst cables out there. And I was very happy that I still had them. And even though they're probably, gosh, these things could be 30 years old now, still going strong, they still sound just fine, and they are fulfilling a need in my system. And you just, you never know what old gems you might find. So I think that really illustrates Paul's point perfectly, that yeah, as long as they're stored well and they haven't been abused, old cables can still work great and present a great value relative to what they cost new. I think when it comes to value, the only other thing to think about is, when it comes to cables, they're not going to make the same order of magnitude of difference that a more major component will. Going from a low-end digital or analog source to a really high-end one is going to make a bigger difference than going from just cheapo big box store cables up to some really high-end audiophile cables will. Or, for example, low-end speakers to really high-end speakers with really good cabinets and really good drivers and really good crossovers. That's going to be a way bigger difference than any cable is probably going to make. That's been my personal experience. Where a component could make like a 30% difference in your overall system performance. Maybe going from lower end cables to higher end cables, maybe it's going to be more like 5% or 10%. And, these things are hard to measure and are very subjective, but all that to say, you've got to appreciate that the order of magnitude that a set of cables is going to make for you is going to be lower than amplifiers or speakers or sources. So if you're trying to decide how much you might really want to spend playing with audio cables, I would keep that in mind. If the cables that you're looking at are going to be 5% of the total cost or the total value, dollar value of your system, then yeah, it's worth playing with. Or if they're 10% of the value, it's worth playing with. I would not try using really expensive cables in a not super duper high-end system, if the total value of your system is $1,000 for everything, all components together, your speakers, your amps, your source, and you're looking at $500 cables, I don't think that's going to be a great trade-off. Those cables are not going to make your other components something that they're not. If anything, they're probably going to show you aspects of those other components that maybe you didn't want to know were there. Maybe you're going to start to really hear the limitations of those components. So all that to say that when it comes to cables, they really are the last thing that you ought to try in your system. Get your system sources and amplifiers and speakers all sorted out first, and make sure that those are all really good quality components that are worthy of playing with sort of the more secondary components like cables and platforms and little tweaks like that. Definitely that's where you need to spend most of your time and effort and money. And after you're happy with your components, keep in mind that the equally important thing to your components is your room and sorting out your room acoustics. So, get your system components sorted, get your room acoustics sorted out. And once you've done all of that and everything is really optimized and you're generally really happy with your system, then maybe you start to play around with your cables. I think for those people who have tried cables and have been disappointed, it might just be that they were trying to throw cables at a system that had other problems that cables couldn't solve. So that's something that I think is really important to think about, and don't assume that going out and buying for $300 a set of cables that originally cost $5,000, don't assume that that's going to be some magic component that's going to turn your system into gold. Everything else needs to be sorted, and then you can let these kinds of tweaks really kind of get you that last 5% of the way, or 2% of the way, or 10% of the way, depending on your system and what you're trying to accomplish. Those are really my thoughts on that. What about you, Paul?
I wouldn't for a moment hesitate to go on the market, the used market, find cables that were glorious in their day, because you know what? They're still glorious.
They are.
And a lot better than buying some cheesy, whatever cable off of Amazon and suffering through that, because cables make a difference.
Yeah.
Expensive cables make, if they're designed right, a really big difference.
Okay. All right. Really expensive cables can really make a big difference if they're designed right, but that's a big if, right? Let's go back to what I was saying earlier about those wacky cables that I had played with that were very expensive, and I bought more cheaply, and they had the fluid-based dielectric. Those were designed in a way that could work for some systems, but didn't work for mine. And when you start to get into those megabuck cables, you're getting into some sometimes very exotic approaches to cable construction, and you need to make sure that that's going to work for you. Again, don't assume that buying cables that used to be $5,000 and are now $500 are just going to be some magic bullet that solves some problem in your system. It might, or it might not. And even if they're well designed, the design objectives that they were made with may or may not be what you want in your system. So I would definitely be careful with that. I've found with cables that there are a couple of different mentalities that manufacturers have when it comes to their design ethos, and that is either they're going for absolute transparency. They want those cables to do absolutely, positively nothing to introduce elements that shouldn't be there, like noise or distortion. So they're going for absolute clarity and transparency. They want to get you as close to nothing at all as possible when it comes to connecting two pieces of equipment, just having nothing there between them, absolute transparency. The other ethos is cables that are designed to be some type of filter between components that alters the sound between your two components. Maybe you love what your preamp is doing in your system, but maybe its voice just a little bit bright for your tastes. Other than that, you love what it's doing, and you love what your amplifier is doing, but you want something between them that might just tame that thing that you're not quite happy with about that preamp. Say it's a little bit bright, and so you want a cable that's maybe going to dull that brightness a little bit and rebalance your system. So those are really, I think, the kind of the two different ways you can approach cables is, do you want absolute transparency, or do you want something that's going to change the sound to help balance out components that maybe don't have perfect synergy but that you otherwise like? I think either approach is fine. I think it's probably in a lot of ways easier to just try and find components that play nice together and have great synergy between them and take the just trying to find a really transparent cable approach. But I've really had it both ways in my systems over the years, and it's just something to think about. If you have gotten a fancy high-end cable in your system and went, this made it worse, probably what was happening was that you needed transparency but got a cable that was more of a system tuning or balancing cable. Maybe it filtered things in a way that you didn't like, or vice versa. You were hoping that the cable would introduce a sonic signature between your components, and it didn't. Maybe it was too transparent and it gave you more of that thing that you didn't like about your system synergy. So a couple of things to definitely think about there, and don't just assume that because it was expensive and now it isn't, that it's going to solve every problem in your system. But also, there are a lot of reasons that cable manufacturers price things the way that they price things. You can't always assume that just because it was really expensive, that it was also really exotic. It might have been, or it might not have been. The manufacturer could have been using pretty tried and true and generally accepted construction methods, and the reason that they were more expensive was it was a small company. Maybe it was only one person or two people making these cables. They were making them in small batches, maybe making 10 cables per month instead of 1,000. So really then you're paying more for people's time. Maybe they're making these things by hand. And so you're paying for the time that went into constructing these cables. You're paying for the boutique element of it. Maybe you're paying for cables that are not super exotic inside, but they have really nice jacketing, and they have some custom shrink tubing with the company's logo on it, and they're putting really, really high quality terminations. Those can get pretty expensive pretty quickly, and when they're being made in lower volumes, in smaller batches, the manufacturers are not benefiting from large quantity discounts in their raw materials to make these things. So all of these things can drive the costs of cables up, and that might be a reason that they're costing more. Or it could just be that they really are using really exotic materials. Extremely, extremely high purity copper, extremely high purity silver, which can get pretty expensive pretty quickly. Maybe they're using a really time-consuming milling process to mill out raw materials into these cables. Maybe they're investing in machinery that can make the cables into a certain geometry. Maybe they're braiding a certain geometry to try and reduce noise pickup along the cable length, things like that. So all of those things can really drive up the price of cables. So there's a lot of different reasons why high-end cables and boutique cables in particular can be expensive. They might be exotic. They might have just been a really small time operation where constructing them cost a lot more money. Oftentimes it's a combination of both. At least that's been my experience, is that there's some combination of both. They're using exotic materials. They're really sweating the little details. They're trying to make a product that is special and interesting. And all of this can be more expensive. And that's really a lot of why those cables are expensive, especially compared to more mass market products where they're not putting a lot of money into the raw materials and they're making so many that they can afford to sell each unit for a little bit less and still make a profit. So things to keep in mind, boring stuff about scales of economy to keep in mind when it comes to cables. And we understand that in the audiophile sphere that, really, a lot of this stuff is specialized. It is a niche market and things are going to cost more because there just aren't as many people buying them, and that does drive costs up as well. So some things to consider when we're talking about cables, cable construction, and the value of them and why they cost what they cost. There's some things to think about there.
But it's not necessary to pay all that money for it, especially if you go on the used market. So yeah, highly, highly recommend doing that. Okay. Go get them.
All right. Yeah. I'm with Paul generally. As long as you understand what it is you're buying, the design objectives that went into the cable by the manufacturer, and understanding that cables that were very expensive years ago, were for some good reason, and that those reasons are going to work for your system. I think those are the main things to keep in mind. And then just making sure that they were stored well over the years, that they were treated well, and that there's not any obvious issues with them. Those are the main things to think about with used cables. But overall, I'm with Paul on this one. As long as you're using your head and a little bit of common sense, buy used cables, try them out, see if they work for you. If they don't, sell them for what you paid for them. And hey, you had a little bit of fun, and that's part of the fun of this hobby. So with all that said, if you enjoyed this video, please do consider throwing me a like. I really appreciate that. If you'd like to see more content like this, consider subscribing. And while we're on the subject, please also consider going and watching the source video from Paul. Go over to his channel, check this out, give him a view count, give him a like. We are lucky to have people like Paul in this hobby sharing their thoughts on this platform. It is not my intention to siphon any views from Paul. So please, if you enjoyed this video and if you enjoyed his thoughts, please also go over to his channel and check out his videos. And with that being said, I thank you for watching this one, and I'll see you next time.